Short swords are an often overlooked subclass of melee weapon, so much so that the game itself completely forgets they exist once you enter hard mode. These little stabbers sit in the shadow cast by their older, much larger brother, the broadsword. But I'm tired of that. Today, short swords will get their time in the spotlight, as I try to take on Calamity using short swords only. I'll also be throwing them on a tier list so you can find out which ones are worth using and which ones aren't. I spawn into the world, and for the first time in a long time, the copper short sword is actually useful, allowing me to at least somewhat defend myself against enemies. Other than my damage being a little low, the early game in this playthrough is surprisingly normal, so after building some NPC housing at spawn, I jump straight into the caves below. The first mining trip turned out to be a success, bringing my health up to 160 and giving me enough gold to make a new short sword, which means it's time to head to the tier list for our first ranking. Now I feel it would be a little pointless to rank every single ore short sword added by vanilla. I'd rather keep the tier list looking a little cleaner, and rather coincidentally, they'd all end up in the same tier anyway, that being C tier. Just imagine the rest of them sitting somewhere in between copper and platinum. Back in the game, I returned to the mines to collect any lead I see, all while keeping an eye out for the marble biome where I can find my next short sword. The biome remained hidden, but I did find enough lead to craft a full set of armour, which Calamity buffs with some damage reduction, regeneration, and most importantly, knockback resistance. With how close I'm going to have to get to hit bosses with my short swords, this armour will prove to be invaluable in the early game, and won't be replaced until I have access to the dungeon for a cobalt shield. After another 3 hours of searching, I finally stumble upon a marble biome, and spend some time farming hoplites for the Gladius. With the amount of lava around, they would often end up taking care of themselves without any involvement from me, so I didn't even notice when the Gladius dropped from a hoplite up above. This relic of the Colosseum stabs out 3 blades in quick succession with slight inaccuracy, which is made up for by its much higher hit rate than even the platinum short sword. Now while it's definitely one of the best pre-boss options in this run, it still suffers from an incredibly short range and low damage for this stage of the game, so I'm afraid I still can't place it any higher than C tier. In fact, the next night I found out that this isn't even strong enough to take down the Eye of Cthulhu, only managing to get it to around 2/3 of its health by 2 AM. It's obvious I'm going to need some upgrades if I have any hope against bosses, and I start the very next morning by summoning the Goblin army. Taking these down with the Gladius wasn't too much of an issue, with the only real difficulty coming from the Goblin archers. Still, I managed to get through the whole event without dying, but it did get close a couple times. Not too long after that I find the Goblin Tinkerer, so I reforge my Gladius to Legendary, then begin the process of combining my accessories. This opens up a slot for something new, so I take a water candle from the dungeon and use it to farm Wolfram enemies at the ocean. The item I'm looking for is called the Rover Drive, which grants the player an energy shield that absorbs up to 20 damage before going on cooldown. Given that the range of most short swords is, well, short, this playthrough is going to rely a lot on accessories like this that allow me to get in close, deal a bunch of damage, and retreat to regenerate my health or shield. To help with that, I prioritise getting warding on any accessory I can afford to. This is pretty much the best loadout I can get pre-boss, so it's about time I take one down, right? The Desert Scourge is my first target of the playthrough, with it being able to drop the Sahara Slicers, by far the best short sword I'll get in pre-hard mode. Fighting the Scourge with the Gladius was far from quick, and I really could have benefited from some armour penetration such as the Sharpening Station or Sharktooth Necklace. On the bright side, not once was I in any kind of danger, with my health barely dropping a few hearts below max. Thankfully the Slicers dropped first time, and even with the legendary modifier. I don't waste any time before testing these out on King Slime, and let me tell you, these things are a massive upgrade to anything that's come before. Not only do they deal way more damage, they also come with a rather neat feature where true melee hits will generate up to 10 bolts behind the player, which can then be thrown at enemies using right click. This gives rise to an incredibly fun combat loop that synergises very well with how the Rover Drive works, and I honestly wish more melee weapons used a system like this, instead of just being manaless mage weapons. Overall, the Sahara Slicers have earned themselves a slot in the A tier, which is a massive relief because these things have to carry me all the way to the Aquatic Scourge. Back at the base, I finally get the item I dethroned all those king slimes for, the crown jewel. This thing is basically a band of regen on steroids, making it the perfect accessory for a challenge like this. So with that obtained, I think it's time for a mini boss rush. From the perforators I get my next gear upgrade in the form of the Bloody Wormtooth, which provides 7 defense and 10% increased melee damage. An excellent accessory for any pre-hard mode melee character. But the boss rush doesn't end there. After taking down Crabulon and the Queen Bee, I remembered that defeating the perforators unlocked Aerialite ore, and with it, Skyline wings. So I make sure to craft these ahead of my fight with Skeletron. Defeating Skeletron unlocks access to the Cobalt Shield, allowing me to finally retire the lead armour I've been using all this time. I decide to replace this with Crimson armour for the enhanced life regen, figuring this would be more beneficial than the added defense and damage from Molten armour. Up until this point, I didn't really have much trouble with any bosses, but the Slime God was proving to be a little tougher. Even with my very high defense, the Paladins dealt a ton of contact damage to me. However, taking this contact damage was really the only way for me to deal damage during the first phase of the fight. Once the slimes start summoning minions though, things get a little easier, as I can hit those to generate bolts for throwing at the Paladins. Definitely a bit of a step up in difficulty from previous bosses, but they go down all the same. Before I fight the Wall of Flesh and enter hard mode, there's a few loose ends I need to tie off on the tier list. I didn't realise until I was editing this, but apparently the Ruler, Umbrella and Tragic Umbrella are all considered Shortswords. I'll be honest here, I completely forgot the Ruler and Tragic Umbrella even existed in the first place, and I only think of the Umbrella as a neat utility item in the early game, rather than as a weapon. I'm going to add them to the tier list all the same, and it should come as no surprise that they're all going straight into the F tier. The Ruler deals decent damage, but is outclassed by the Gladius and many of the ore short swords which can be obtained much more easily than it. As for the two umbrellas, well, I'm judging these solely based on their performance as a weapon, and not whether they're good as utility items. With that out of the way, I build a bridge across hell for the Wall of Flesh fight and give it a test run without potions. It seems my damage is pretty low, so I briefly consider taking down the Aquatic Scourge for my next weapon upgrade. But after 7 minutes of fighting, I've only taken down about 20% of his health bar, so it's clear this won't be the path forward. Another Wall of Flesh fight with potions gets me actually pretty close to winning, but running out of space on my hell bridge certainly didn't help. So after expanding the bridge, clearing out some of the roof, and even placing down some arena buffs along it, I resummon the wall. Now that I'm in hard mode, there's a lot of upgrades I can get which should make my life a little easier against the Aquatic Scourge. The first of those is better armour, so I descend into the caves and while mining for palladium, I come across a mimic that drops me the exact 2 items I needed from it, those being the Philosopher's Stone and Titan Glove. After collecting a bit more ore, I return home and upgrade these to the Charm of Myths and Power Glove. Then craft a full set of palladium armour for the increased defence, damage and regen it gives me. With all the new accessories I'll be getting at this point of the game, reforging is going to become quite expensive, so I take some time to optimise the goblin's happiness by moving in the dye trader. To do this, I just need to craft a new table and chair, which has never been so easy than with today's sponsor, FlexiSpot. A few months ago I bought the FlexiSpot E7 Pro standing desk, and I can honestly say I haven't looked back since. Being able to completely change my setup with the click of a button has made it much easier to get through those particularly long editing sessions. So when FlexiSpot reached out asking to sponsor this portion of the video, I was thrilled to accept. They sent me their XC6 recliner chair, a very spacious reclining seat available in 7 different colours. It boasts a 145 degree recline and a 360 degree swivel, making it incredibly comfortable and adaptable to suit whatever I'm doing. I've had the chair for a few days now, and whether I'm reading, playing games or watching TV, it's quickly become my favourite place to sit at home. FlexiSpot are offering 10% off site-wide across Black Friday weekend, with additional discounts in the lead up to the sale. If you're looking for a new desk or chair to upgrade your gaming setup, a new sofa or recliner for your living room, or maybe just some new cable management solutions, I'd highly recommend checking out FlexiSpot using the link below. Big thanks to FlexiSpot for sponsoring this portion of the video. With the housing complete, I get back to collecting more items to reforge, starting with the giant tortoise shell. A very tanky accessory that comes with 15 defense, 5% damage reduction, and most importantly knockback immunity, allowing it to replace my obsidian shield. Adding a gravestone to my magic storage system allows me to convert the Brain of Confusion into a worm scarf, which I can then combine with my bloody worm tooth to get the aptly named bloody worm scarf, giving me the same effects of the tooth but with an added 10% damage reduction. I then take down the 2 evil bosses once again and craft the amalgamated brain, which grants a dodge along with some extra damage. Now that my survivability is in a really good spot, I next want to work on my mobility, with the best options in early hard mode being the fairy boot and fairy wing combination. This results in a bit of a conceptual clash with the bleeding dead worm I'm wearing as a scarf, the 2 brains I've smashed together and the hollowed out tortoise shell I'm using as a shield. But regardless, I'm feeling about ready to take on the Aquatic Scourge. So all that's left to do is grab some potions and head to the ocean. Yeah, this kind of damage isn't going to get us anywhere, at least not within this lifetime. It took over 18 minutes of fighting to get to this point, and I really don't want to have a 30-minute fight on my hands. Luckily though, I still have one more trick up my sleeve, and all it takes is a quick trip to the Corrupted Sky Island for some blocks, which I then place down on the surface to allow hive tumours to spawn. Taking down one of these will then spawn the Hive Mind, which in hard mode drops the cursed flames needed to make cursed flasks, which are much better at dealing with the Scourge than the Ichor ones I used on the last attempt. With this one simple change to my weapon in view, the fight goes much faster than before. But don't get me wrong, it still takes a lot longer than any normal playthrough would. I resort to the tactic of dodging the boss while my adrenaline or rage charges, then rushing in to deal massive damage before retreating and repeating. It takes multiple cycles of this to whittle down the boss's health, and at one point near the end, a single bit of bad positioning almost ends it all. But somehow I managed to survive and regenerate enough health to see me through the fight, which I should point out still took almost 12 minutes. The one saving grace from this whole exchange is that the Scourge is kind enough to give me the submarine shocker on the first win, and I don't think words can describe just how much of an upgrade this thing is. Now sure, it doesn't have an option to attack from a range like the Sahara Slicers do, and the short range does make it difficult to hit some of the bosses fought at this stage of the game, but when this thing does hit an enemy, it seriously hits that enemy. Skeletron Prime may not be the best boss to showcase the full potential of this beautiful little blade, so to show you just how insanely overpowered the submarine shocker is against the right enemy, here's the entirety of the destroyer fight. I think it goes without saying that we found our first S tier short sword. Using the retreat and repeat method from before lets this thing take down the twins with very little difficulty. Then after upgrading to hallowed armour, the same goes for Cryogen and Plantera. I mean, just look at that incredible damage when paired with Adrenaline. It absolutely decimates the boss's health. My first attempt against the Calamitas clone ends prematurely when I get a little too eager to deal damage and take a little too much of it myself. But after mining up some perennial ore and crafting a set of Reaver armour with the defensive helmet, I return to destroy the clone. Defeating the clone unlocks the cores of Calamity used in my next weapon upgrade. But to get the life alloy I need, I'll have to take down either the Golem or Ravager, and my first attempts against each of them go pretty poorly to say the least. I think the high damage output of the submarine shocker was tricking me into being too aggressive when in reality I should have been playing it much safer. So that's exactly what I do on my next fight against Golem, ensuring that I only try to deal damage to him when my health is at or near its maximum. This also entails being hyper aware of my potion cooldown, letting me use it to quickly recover from or extend how long I can deal damage to the boss. Once the Golem's head detaches, there's literally no way for me to deal damage to it, so I just have to put up with the additional projectiles it fires for the rest of the fight. I do get down to a single heart at one point, but manage to claw my way back thanks to my fast regen, allowing me to finish the Golem off with a combination of rage and adrenaline. The Picksaw Golem drops has just enough pickaxe power to mine the scoria ore found in the Abyss, which is the final material I need to craft the next short sword in progression, the Lucrecia. This has a much lower damage output than the submarine shocker, but makes up for it with its much higher range, allowing me to finally deal some damage to bosses without taking a crazy amount of it myself. I used the rest of the scoria I collected to craft a set of hydrothermal armour and wings, then it's time for a quick rematch with the Ravager, this time using the Lucrecia. The long, piercing projectile let out by this sword deals excellent damage against the many segments of the Ravager in Phase 1, and allows me to actually hit the head once it detaches from the body, which the submarine shocker was way too small to do. Once the head goes down, this fight becomes incredibly easy. Just stand still until the Ravager hovers over you, then dash out of the way. That's literally it. Ravager drops a consumable that increases the duration of rage mode by 1 second, along with the Blood Pact, an amazing survivability accessory that increases max HP and the health received from healing potions by 25%. These upgrades allow me to quickly take down Astrum Aureus for the upgrade he drops to Adrenaline, then it's pretty much straight onto the next boss, where I'll be able to get the next and final short sword in hard mode. I'll be honest here, I really struggled against the Empress. For a lot of the fight, she was ever so slightly outside of the Lucrecia's range, which really hurt my damage output and increased the length of the fight significantly. Now I could have used more accessories that boosted damage to compensate for this, but I'm not too confident with this fight in Revengeance, so had to rely on my survivability accessories to stay alive. After dying on the first attempt without any hope of winning, I decided to skip to the Lunatic Cultist, a fight which I'm much more confident with. The Lucrecia is pretty decent at this fight, dealing enough damage to take down the cultist in a reasonably short time frame. With the cultist defeated, I take down a few pillar enemies for materials and craft the Absorber, an accessory that grants increased movement and jump speed, knockback immunity, a strong Thorns effect that debuffs enemies and heals you for 5% of the attack's damage, and spawns an aura when you use a healing potion that gives increased regen, damage and damage reduction, along with removing all debuffs. In short, this thing isn't half bad, especially when combined with the Charm of Myths and Blood Pact, which also buff healing potions. In addition to this, I craft the Ambrosial Ampule, another survivability accessory that gives 50 extra life, an increase to regen the lower your health is, and even more regen when afflicted with a damaging debuff, along with halving how long you are affected by fire or sickness debuffs. With these upgrades, it should be pretty hard for me to die, right? Unfortunately no, as my next attempt against the Empress proves. Thankfully, my third try goes a little better, but I don't end up getting the drop I wanted, and then my next attempt after that one also results in a failure. It takes another 3 victories against the Empress to finally get the drop I wanted, the Starlight. Now I know some of you may be thinking this isn't a short sword because it spawns a projectile rather than using the blade itself, but I think it acts and feels enough like one in order to use it in this playthrough. And the Calamity developers obviously agree, as it's a material used in a short sword further down the line. Either way, it doesn't really change much about the playthrough, as it falls almost directly between the Lucrecia and Submarine Shocker in both damage output and range, which means it's almost always better to use one of those over the Starlight. For this reason, I'll be placing it in the B tier, a solid option, but outclassed by weapons I already have. With that slight disappointment out of the way, it's time to take down the remaining pillars and have a go at the Moonlord. The first attempt was not successful, but also not awful, so after expanding my arena I resummon the boss and hope that this is enough to turn the tides in my favour. Honestly, any of the 3 weapons I have could have probably worked here, and in roughly the same time too. So for the first half of the fight I find myself switching between them, trying to find the one I like the most. The higher range of the Lucrecia makes it a safe option to use while regenerating health or charging adrenaline. And when that is charged, the obvious option for maximum damage is the Submarine Shocker. In Phase 2 it's a bit harder to hit the core using the short range options, so I mostly just run away while using the Lucrecia. From that point on it's a pretty easy fight, and before long the final boss of Vanilla falls. Now while the Moonlord may be the final boss of Vanilla, it's certainly not the final boss of Calamity, so we still have a lot left to do in this journey. First on that list is crafting the Elemental Shiv, an upgrade to the Starlight that acts in a completely different way, relying much more on homing projectiles and thus massively increasing my range over previous short swords. The Shiv is incredibly easy to use as its projectiles home into enemies and deal excellent damage, earning it a spot in the A tier. Overall, it's a really solid weapon that you should consider checking out in your next Calamity playthrough. You should also consider subscribing to the channel if you've made it this far into the video. I put a ton of work into these, so any support is greatly appreciated. After crafting up some solar armour and an accessory that combines wings and boots, I'm already in a great spot to take on the next boss, so I clear out a small area in the underworld and summon the Profaned Guardians. The Guardians honestly weren't that hard, so filled with confidence I head straight into the Providence fight while my buffs are still active. At this point you might be expecting me to say this was some big mistake and I should have spent more time preparing, but surprisingly Providence was pretty easy as well, with the Elemental Shiv making quick work of her. I'm lucky enough to get exactly one more Divine Geode than I need to craft a full set of Tarragon armour, so after mining up a load of Eulabloom ore in the jungle, that's exactly what I do. It's then time to take down Providence once again, this time in the Hallowed, to get her wings and more Divine Geodes which I turn into an Elderberry for the permanent health upgrade. Somewhere in between that I also defeat Cygnus, but it's Cygnus so he's not really worth talking about. What is worth talking about is the Stormweaver, which I ended up having a lot of trouble with. The first half of each fight would go pretty well, but then I'd suddenly find it nearly impossible to dodge his dashes in the second phase, leading to quite a few deaths. I decided to instead head to the dungeon to take on the Ceaseless Void, but while finishing up the arena I accidentally spawned the Poltergeist instead. I was a little thrown off but gave it a go anyway, and to my surprise the fight ended up going really well. I think I'm still a little tender from the predictive dashes Poltergeist did in previous versions of the mod, which makes me instantly scared of any interaction with the boss. Thankfully the devs came to see reason and removed the predictable dashes along with making the clone damageable, which allows you to dash through either of them to avoid taking damage. Poltergeist dropped some really useful items for me, first of which is the Ecto Heart that permanently increases adrenaline damage. Then there's the Affliction, an all-round excellent accessory that increases many of the player's base stats. And finally, Ruinous Souls, a crafting ingredient which I can use for my next short sword. The Galileo Gladius is an upgrade to the Vanilla Gladius from pre-hard mode, and shoots fast-moving crescents that home into and pierce through multiple enemies. Against a single target it deals an admirable amount more damage than the Elemental Shiv, but against multiple targets it completely blows it out of the water, a trait which will make it particularly useful against certain upcoming enemies. Considering this weapon is viable all the way from Poltergeist to the final two bosses of the game, I don't think it would be fair to place it any lower than S tier. This thing easily takes down the buffed up Ravager, which now drops Bloodstone that can be used to craft a new set of armour. But to do that I first need to take down the Poltergeist again for more Ruinous Souls. So I head back to the dungeon to fight it once again and also take on the Ceaseless Void while I'm here, which the Galileo Gladius sees no issue in striking down. Back home I craft the Bloodflare armour, giving me the power boost needed to finally succeed against the Stormweaver. With its drops I can now craft the Cosmic Worm and summon the Devourer of Gods. Defeating the Devourer stands as the final barrier to the endgame, with new accessories, armour and even a new short sword now being available. To make these though, I'll need a Cosmic Anvil, which is the perfect place to craft a Cosmic Shiv, the final upgrade to the Starlight that fires homing stars at enemies. The fire rate is much slower than the Galileo Gladius, but the damage is slightly better, so both short swords still have their place in my loadout. Overall, I'm going to give the Cosmic Shiv an A tier ranking. It's a very good weapon, but realistically it doesn't offer much over the Gladius I already have. With that, I've now ranked every single short sword in Vanilla and Calamity, and it would appear that there's some kind of connection between those on the bottom and those on the top. Rather curious indeed. Now that I have my final weapon, it was time to end this playthrough on a high. First, I upgrade a bunch of accessories using materials from the buffed moon events, craft a full set of Godslayer armour, and then it's straight into the Yaren fight. I really was not expecting to beat Yaren on the first try, but perhaps some of my previous playthroughs are starting to actually make me better at the game. A crazy thought, I know. Using the Yaren Soul fragments with some Auric ore, I can then make some final upgrades before continuing on to the final two bosses of the game. While these fights play out in the background, I figured now would be a good time to give a bit of a review of the short sword subclass as a whole. While it may be small both on a meta and literal level, this subclass has plenty of fun weapons that will get you really thinking about the mechanics of each boss fight. I had the most fun while using short swords that really encourage you to get up in the boss's face to deal damage, forcing you to think of your health as a resource that you can consume to deal damage. Because of that, I feel the subclass somewhat loses its identity in the post-Moonlord stage, where every weapon suddenly shoots projectiles with insane range and homing, making the subclass much more similar to Ranger or Mage than anything like Melee. That's maybe best saved for a greater discussion about true melee versus projectiles though. It's just a shame to see this subclass do so well with the dilemma for so much of the game, only for it to drop the ball on the final three weapons. If you enjoyed this video, then you'll probably like this one I did a few months ago where I collect every single dagger from the Rogue class in Calamity. It didn't do too well in the algorithm, so it may not have been suggested to you, but I'd highly recommend watching it. Either way, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and thanks for watching.